A quick disclaimer before we begin that this podcast is for adult audiences only. Though Dr. Bates is a medical professional, we are not able to provide specific medical advice or recommendations.
We are both certified cannabis coaches, but we are not therapists. Our experiences and those of our guests are purely our own, and everything we share is for educational purposes only.
Also, please note that there will be some explicit language, as we always keep it real on this show.
Puff with Pride!
Welcome back to the CannaQueerious Podcast for another episode. Today we're going to talk about CannaPride because it is Pride Month. So we definitely need to hit on that history, the terms, discuss how cannabis and the LGBT community intersects. Yeah, it's Pride Month.
Yeah, how's Pride Month been treating you so far?
It's been pretty good. I haven't been doing much really when it comes to Pride, except for going to DC to the No Homo show, which really was dope. Meeting DJ XL and Boss Brit, the most lit. The first thing that DJ XL said, she was like, "You the doctor." I was like, oh, wow. She knew I was the doctor. And I was like, yeah, I'm Dr. D.
Yeah, you're getting notoriety out there.
Just to thank them for paving the way and offering that safe space for us because needed.
It's nice that you're getting some notoriety and some recognition. It was a great show.
And then just learning like where even this podcast could go. You never know. CannaQueerious Podcast doing live tours, but hey, we bringing the wellness, that intentionality with cannabis to the forefront.
Absolutely.
So how is Pride showing up for you right now? Are you doing anything?
I have been to no Pride events. So I live in Virginia, in Richmond specifically, and it's weird around here because our main Pride event is in September. And so Pride Month in June, there are lots of events and things going on. The Richmond Pride, the Richmond queer community in general, I think needs a little bit of like centralization and also possibly more diversity within that centralization because the majority of queer events that I do go to tend to be mostly, if not all, white folks. So we need to see more POC up in there for sure. Because we're here and we're queer, as they say. I want to see more of us and know where I can community gathering for us.
I know we usually have Black Pride and then you have like regular Pride, but it'd be nice just let it all be one. But like you said, sometimes it can be slightly segregated and it sucks that it's like that.
Just goes to show how much work still needs to be done.
I know, right? I know. Let's just get into it. Cannabis history. Can you tell us about the ancient roots or the ancient history of how cannabis was utilized to include its purposes and how it served them back then?
Yes, and I actually wanted to find this quote because right now I am currently reading the CBD Bible by Dr. Danny Gordon. If you have not read it, I 10 out of 10 recommend. It gives a lot of validation to cannabis use and efficacy and research and all of the different ways that this plant has been used. And she had a quote in here that was talking about the ancient civilizations. So it has been used for the last, at least that we know of, the last 12,000 years. It's been used for medical, spiritual, and social purposes. So specifically, we know of its use originating out of Asia, but also prevalence in Africa and the Middle East. But it's been used for fiber, textiles, general industrial use to make clothes. It's been used pretty much across the globe for many different reasons. Dr. Danny Gordon talks about how it's likely that cannabis as a distinct species is at least 38 million years old. And humans evolved in places where the cannabis plant grew. And so if you look at the spread of how cannabis grew over time, it also correlates with the spread of how people populated the earth, which I find really interesting. We've always gravitated towards this plant. I wonder why. Could it be the value that it provides? I think yes, but the government likes to say no. But there's been documented use for at least the past 200 years in terms of using it medicinally.
Like I said, years ago, even ancient Chinese surgeons that utilize cannabis as an anesthetic. Hey, having surgery, cannabis, that's what we're going to use. It definitely has some therapeutic benefits that's been used for thousands of years for sure.
Yeah, some of the civilizations that used it were ancient Japan and China, which makes sense because it originated in Asia, but also in Egypt and ancient Greece and in Rome. And it was part of not only their medicinal practice, but their spiritual practice as well, which makes a lot of sense of why people even today are using it spiritually as a way to connect with themselves and connect with what's outside of us as humans. It was brought to the Americas from the 1600s forward. So it's been in this space for quite a long time as well. Also, and again, this is all coming from the CBD Bible, but the ancient Sumerians, Akkadians, and Egyptians got in on the action using it too. This is a direct quote. Using cannabis as a medicine for problems ranging from grief to seizures, eye conditions, and even the relief of labor pain. It was used as one of the 5 sacred plants in Hindu religious texts. It has been used for fever, asthma, digestive issues, anxiety, seizures, and skin disorders. Pretty much any kind of ailment in history, cannabis has been linked to using, and we can talk a little bit more about that. And we did a little bit with the endocannabinoid system and giving an overview of that, but we are finding more and more evidence all the time that the ECS, the endocannabinoid system, is linked to the functioning of almost every other system in our body. And so using cannabis as a supplement to that ECS, it makes sense why it's been used for so long for so many different things very effectively.
What about early regulation within the United States?
It was brought over with colonization in the 1600s and was used as medicine. Since then, it used to be a part of the United States pharmacopoeia. It was prescribed often. You could get it at the version of CVS that existed back in the 18 and early 1900s. But attitudes started to shift in the early 20th century because they were perceiving their intoxicating effects. In reality, it was because other industries started to realize the potential that cannabis had to take them over. So we're talking not only big pharma, right, but also big lumber got threatened because of its industrial uses. Big cotton got threatened because of its textile uses. Like all of these big industries realized that they could potentially have a major competitor in cannabis. So a quick overview of like how medical history happened, and I'm sure you could talk about this more as well, but when they created a systemic, universally understood doctrine for what medical doctors were going to learn, so they linked all of the textbooks, all of the training, all of the criteria. They standardized how medical doctors were going to be trained. And by doing that, they specifically aligned it with pharmacology and with big pharma and how those medicines were being produced and sold. And they specifically removed any information, any validity that they were giving to natural and herbal remedies, including cannabis. And so that kind of starts the shift in perception from the medical community around the validity of cannabis, because they literally wouldn't put it in textbooks. And we're saying only this list of pharmacological, prescribable, manufactured medicines were going to be taught, and the efficacy and how those work in the body. So that's the beginning of the shift. And then when we get into the early 1930s, late 1920s, we come to the Marijuana Tax Act. So I guess that was actually the late 30s. They saw the threat that was coming from cannabis towards all these big industries, and capitalism is going to do what capitalism does. It goes to the government and says, hey, we need to figure out some kind of way to block this. And so while they were working on the best way to do that, which turned out to be the Marijuana Tax Act, they also were starting to shift public perception. So we've had the medical community shift, and now we're having the public perception shift. So they start putting out the Reefer Madness video of the old black and white 1930s, these white people smoking weed and going crazy, doing crazy things that cannabis does not cause you to do in any way. They started using the word marijuana and were linking it to the Mexican immigrants that were coming in post the Mexican Revolution. And of course, the majority of white America was already feeling hella racist towards these Mexicans. And so they're like, oh, they use it? Like, no, not I. Like, people literally were going to the pharmacies and getting this as a prescription. But as soon as that public perception shifted, they were like, oh no, we're buying into the propaganda, into the racism, and we are going to shift how we view it as well. So around that time, it gets removed from the pharmacopoeia against pharmacist approval. Almost all of them said, yes, this is medicine. Yes, it should stay in here. And the government was like, nope, we're going to take it out. We disagree. And then in 1937, we have the Marijuana Tax Act.
Isn't that fun? You go from a freaking plant, a natural plant that was legal. You could basically get it from your doctor. A prescription could have been written. Easily got it over the counter like Robitussin. But now, because of this foolishness, now it's prohibited.
Yeah, they literally said, nah, we gonna keep our coins and we're gonna do what we do, which is use capitalism, greed, and propaganda. They use the racism that's already present in the country. So I think it's interesting when we talk about how it was racially motivated in terms of how the public responded to it, but they distinctly and very specifically monopolized on the racism that was already present. So they just fueled that forward, which we see in a lot of other instances throughout history as well.
Tell them a little bit more about the war on drugs, cannabis legalization, and social justice.
Yeah. So like I said, 1937, we have the Marijuana Tax Act. Again, they tried to say that it was because cannabis was so intoxicating and so dangerous. They weren't using gateway drug language at that point, but it was very much hinted at. But again, it was really fueled by propaganda interests. With the Reefer Madness was the first big publication, but I don't know if any of you guys have seen the posters of the devil's lettuce and like things like that. Like they were using Christianity to try to change the public perception around this plant. So with the Marijuana Tax Act, essentially it said that marijuana was going to be taxed extremely high. And this is right before it gets classified as a Schedule 1. They introduce the schedule for drugs and it becomes a Schedule 1 substance. But the Marijuana Tax Act specifically criminalized its use and its cultivation and put extremely high taxes and fines, and people could get in like serious legal trouble if they were found prescribing or using this plant. And so then we get into, this is like Harry Anslinger, his era. He's the one that actually was the big proponent of the Marijuana Tax Act. Again, not for any medical reason, but simply because he was part of the big lobbying group that was against cannabis. And so the war on drugs begins. And then you get President Richard Nixon in office in the 70s. And he starts talking about how cannabis and drug abuse in general is public enemy number one. And we could also talk about the fact that they were pumping other substances into poorer communities to perpetuate this idea that Black and brown communities and people are the only ones using these drugs. There's a lot of history that's really wrapped up into it. And because at that point, cannabis is classified as a Schedule 1, it gets lumped in with a lot of these other harmful, true substance abuse drugs. And so cannabis, because it was prevalent a lot in a lot of Black and brown communities, because we have always been the ones that are most connected to the earth and to herbal medicine. But because of this crackdown, we started seeing harsher laws and like it's much easier to get locked up for using weed or even possession crimes and all of this stuff. They outlaw possession, distribution, cultivation, anything having to do with the plant, which again was to target Black and brown communities while also serving their goal of keeping big pharma, big lumber, big cotton at the top of the game.
I know we have a lot to talk about when it comes to the history and how it has impacted Black and brown communities, but things are somewhat changing. So within recent years, what have you seen that's changing?
And we're going to talk a little bit more about Prop 215, but that was the beginning of at least legislation and accessibility around cannabis. So recent years, we definitely have started to see the attitude shift towards cannabis because people are starting to learn more about it. We have the discovery. If you remember the history lesson from, I think, episode 1 or 2, we talked about how the endocannabinoid system was discovered. And so as we have learned about this system, we are starting to get limited research because, of course, federal dollars is where big studies and things like that can come from. But we have started to see a lot more research about the endocannabinoid system because we are having more legalization. A lot of states have started with like medical legalization first and then moving into adult use as well. But we are starting to see a major shift just like in public perception of the plant because it's helping so many people, right? Like the more access you have to a plant that has been historically shown to be used for all of these different medical and medicine, like not just medical, but also like wellness uses and treatments and conditions over time, people are starting to see the value in that, and more people have access to it. And so people are starting to understand not only the efficacy of it, but we're starting to uncover more of the history. People were talking about Harry Anslinger and the Marijuana Tax Act and the history of cannabis. And once you learn the history, you really can't deny that it was something that was literally kept away from us so that we would not have access to it and would not see the full potential and be able to unleash its power, quote unquote. Definitely a massive shift in public perception. I just saw a study recently that was talking about how, I want to say it was like 72, it was above 70% of adults would vote to like fully legalize weed. So like the tides have definitely turned back from the days of the Reefer Madness videos and whatnot. But it really, the point that I always like to bring up in an advocacy space is now that we are having states legalize this drug, people are still getting arrested for it. People are still serving time for it. And so we are having a really massive discrepancy between people out there, specifically white men, most of the time making billions of dollars out of an industry that is still disproportionately incarcerating and affecting Black and brown communities. So even though we are seeing this shift, if you guys are up to date around rescheduling, there's a big move right now to reschedule cannabis from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3. It reduces the significance of any sort of crime that can be committed with using cannabis, but in reality, it doesn't release anybody from jail, it doesn't expunge any records, and it just gives Big Pharma a chance to get in there first. There's a shift, but we got to keep shifting to get where we need to go.
Yes, the change is coming, and we see it, but it really is the bigger change that we truly need, which is our Black and brown people sitting in jail while we sitting here celebrating and enjoying cannabis, basically off their back. In a sense, they were already doing this before we even got into it. So that definitely sucks. And I can't wait to see the day that everyone is released for this. And I would love to see those that are serving time actually in the position, having the dispensaries, having whatever business it is that they need within the cannabis space.
Reparations.
Hey.
That is reparations.
For real.
We deserve them.
For real. We're going to take a quick puff break, and when we come back, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the cannabis history.
This episode is sponsored by...
If you're passionate about cannabis and have a desire to teach others that cannabis is healthy, maybe being a cannabis educator is in your future as well. I did my training at the Cannabis Coaching Institute and wholeheartedly recommend it. The Cannabis Coaching Institute's Certified Cannabis Educator Program is now globally accredited by the International Practitioners of Holistic Medicine. In as little as 12 weeks, you can be out there certified, putting on workshops, talks, retreats, or doing creative work like putting out podcasts like this one, writing books, all centered around helping others with this powerful plant. So if you have a health and wellness business, or if you're feeling called to work with this plant in some way and want to enter the cannabis industry, go to cannabiscoachinginstitute.com to learn more. And make sure to use the coupon code CannaQueerious for 10% off your tuition. All right, everybody, welcome back. We just took a quick little puff break, but we are planning to have a community space where you guys will be able to see some of the behind the scenes puff breaks, those types of things. But we want to get back into this conversation around like the social history of cannabis and how queer people fit into it, because it is often not known that queer people actually were majorly a part of the recent legalization movement of cannabis. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why that happened, how that happened, and what it looked like. So, Dr. D, who is Dennis Perron, and how did his activism contribute to the medical cannabis movement? I hear that name come up a lot in queer spaces around cannabis, so let's break it down for the people.
Okay, so Father Dennis, that's who we're going to talk about right now. So Dennis Perron, he's the father of medical cannabis legalization. He's been coined the father of this. And the reason for that is because, one, he was the founder of the first public cannabis dispensary within North America, and it was called the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club, which he created with his husband, John Entwistle, and that was back in 1992. And so if anybody knows about the 90s, that was also the time where there was an AIDS epidemic. And so what happened was that Dennis' husband, John, ended up contracting the AIDS virus. And so he witnessed, one, the discrimination and also the lack of healthcare options within the queer community during this AIDS epidemic. And so he and some other people, Dennis himself and some other people, they got together and they created or co-authored the Proposition 215, which was the Compassionate Use Act in 1996, which aided in the passing of Proposition 64, which actually legalized medical cannabis in California, which has definitely helped pave the way for now broader legalization efforts within the United States and even internationally.
Yeah, he clearly was a huge part in not only just like gay advocacy or queer advocacy, but also in the cannabis movement, which really has a rollout into the medical community at large. So he is definitely a name that we need to know. So what are some things that current cannabis activists can learn from what Dennis Perron did?
You definitely have to come to the table with a strong backbone. I will say that. Basically, really 10 toes down, definitely grounded, finding your support system, because government, they could give two craps about what we truly think when it comes to medical cannabis. Yes, there's the whole Schedule 1 down to Schedule 3, but at the same time, that Schedule 3 is really helping the bigger corporations. We're mainly at that local level. Like, we're trying to be Dennis in a sense and still pushing for the release of Black and brown people who's in jail right now, still fighting for reparations, still just fighting for LGBT rights, fighting for our own representation in the cannabis industry. So you have to have a backbone. I don't think there's no other way to put it, but you have to know this is what you truly want to do, because if not, they can definitely eat you up.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, like, he was coming with firsthand experience, like a very compelling story of how this had helped him and people that he knew and all of that. So I think that also is a lesson we can take from him for sure. Was there anyone else involved in the movement on the from the queer community or having to do with the queer community that we should also know about?
There were some other people besides, yes, of course, Dennis and his husband. There was a nurse, so shout out to all nurses. And Boyce, she was a registered nurse who also helped Dennis co-author the Proposition 215.
What about Mary Brown?
So she basically volunteered at the San Francisco General Hospital. So during the AIDS epidemic, what she would do, she actually would bake brownies and go to the hospital and just distribute them among the AIDS patient.
What kind of brownie?
Cannabis infused brownies, girl.
There we go. The funny brownies.
It's a great thing that she did this because it helped to destigmatize cannabis use for medicinal purposes, because obviously access to healthcare was lacking. Medications definitely was lacking. We don't have the medications that they have now as far as the prevention of AIDS and whatnot. Yeah, no, shout out to Brownie Mary for going into hospitals and passing out those infused brownies to help AIDS patients.
Yeah, another icon. We love to see it. So a reminder that it really just takes one person to make a difference. And these people are clear examples of that. So thanks for giving us a rundown of some of the icons within the community. All right. So now that we've gone over the history, we've gone over some icons, we've talked a little bit about the current social perception, but what is the current state of queers in cannabis? What are we seeing in the industry? What have we seen in terms of representation? What are your takes on it?
It's lacking. It's empty. I feel like it's just not enough. When it comes to queer cannabis brands, I have had a hard time finding them. Yes, I went to Google, I did the search, but nothing really came up. And the things that did come up, it basically was like a 404 error page, or they haven't been posting, which means they're not as active, but still there's no way to contact them. Or asking Facebook for recommendations. I've asked people in general, and like all I hear is crickets. It's a silence. It's no noise at all when it comes to LGBT people in the cannabis industry. And there are a few, don't get me wrong, but it is lacking.
I would definitely agree with that. It's very hard to find queer-owned brands, queer-owned businesses, any of that kind of stuff in the cannabis space. Part of the reason we're doing this podcast is to show some representation and make a space or help make a space for queer people, because there very much isn't one there. There are some people that we definitely want to give shout outs to, though, that we have seen putting in the work, representing the community, both communities, really, like the queer community and the Canna community. So I don't know if there's anyone you wanted to shout out in particular.
Definitely want to shout out Rich. Rich is a cool dude. You can find him on Instagram. He's Queer in Cannabis. He just offers that safe community. He also shares posts about the history of queers in cannabis, hence his IG name. But too, out in Massachusetts, out in Boston, if you don't have anything to do, he definitely has some events going on. He actually has one coming up on June the 20th. So check out his IG.
Also, swag from Queer in Cannabis is 10 out of 10. I am literally... should have already bought one, but I'm definitely getting me one this month, because Rich is out here doing his thing, trying to create space, and definitely check out the swag in addition to the events for sure.
Yeah, and then we also have a scientist within the LGBT space, in the queer space, Dr. Miyabe Shields. Definitely want to shout you out, because you are doing really big things in the cannabis space, and we thank you for that.
Speaking of Dr. Miyabe Shields, she has this book called High Hopes, which says it's a quest of a queer neurodivergent stoner scientist. I started reading it. It's freaking phenomenal. If you identify with any of those communities, definitely check this out as well. They are doing amazing work.
Thank you, Dr. Shields. And what about you? Anybody you want to shout out?
Definitely a big shout out to Amber E. Center. She's the co-founder, chair of the board, and executive director of Supernova Women, which was founded in 2014, an organization dedicated to empowering people of color to become self-sufficient cannabis industry shareholders. So she is really putting the work in there. I've seen her posting stuff about like at advocacy events. She's up at the White House talking to people. She is out here spreading the word and making moves for people of color to have a space in this industry that, again, has disproportionately, targetedly harmed us. So definitely a big shout out to the work that she is doing. Also with Marker House, which she's the CEO of, which is a distribution and infused cannabis products company. So we do have at least one company that we can say is queer owned and queer and Black owned. So that's super dope. Big shout out to Amber. Lastly, because we're keeping it in the queer community, especially during Pride Month, we have to shout out Laganja Estranja. For any of my drag race friends, definitely want to give her a shout out as well. She has been very public about her cannabis use and advocacy. So definitely check all these people out. We will have info about them listed in the show notes, but if you're looking for queers in cannabis to follow, definitely give these four a good run.
Any queer brands you want to shout out?
Yeah, again, it was really tough to find any. The ones that did come up and that I've heard of a bit is Can Infused Drinks, and that's CANN, but they're out in Cali, right? So like a lot of these places are only in states that have fully legal adult use markets. And so a lot of people unfortunately don't have access to some of these brands, which is, again, a part of the major problem that we have in this industry. But Can Infused Drinks is definitely one. Sunday School Edibles and Pre-Rolls. Can, which is out in Massachusetts. That's actually the largest LGBTQ cannabis company. And then Peak Extracts, which is out in Oregon. I'm sure there are more, right? There have to be more queer-owned cannabis brands out there. So if you listeners, viewers, if you know of any, please comment for us. We're definitely going to be putting together some sort of list. Rich from Queer in Cannabis is compiling a database of sorts so that we have a resource to look for us in these spaces, but we want to get as much information as we can. So definitely tag anyone, any businesses, small or large, that you know that are in the cannabis space.
Yeah. If you want to sponsor us, that's another way to get your business out there. We're definitely here for it. DM us or email us at info@CannaQueerious.com. We would love to have you on the show, or hey, even to sponsor us. So yeah,
let's support each other. Mutually beneficial. All right, y'all. So this was our second episode coming out during Pride Month. We went over some of the history of how this plant has been used, the history of how the queer community has been pioneers in terms of legalization, giving you some reference points, some people to follow and stay in the loop with when it comes to being queer in cannabis. And also talked a little bit about just like what the landscape looks like and what, we didn't talk about what we hope to get out of it, but maybe we'll cover that in another episode. Thanks for listening to another episode of the CannaQueerious Podcast. Happy Pride Month continued. We hope you're out there living your most authentic selves, having the best time ever, being full of pride, whatever that looks like for you. Hopefully you learned a little bit about cannabis, but also maybe enjoyed the conversation. Again, we're going to put those cool people in the show notes. But with that, as always, follow, subscribe, give us feedback. We really want to hear from you about what you want to know more about, what you want to hear more of, what you want to hear less of. We are in the very beginning stages of this, so we want all the feedback, okay? Give it to us, please. But for real, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and share with a friend. And as always, remember to puff it with pride.